This idea that Putin is reconstructing the Russian Empire, this is childish propaganda. Excuse me. If anyone knows the day-to-day and year-to-year history, this is childish stuff. Childish stuff seems to work better than adult stuff. So no designs at all. The United States decided this man must be overthrown. It's called a regime change operation. There have been about 100 of them by the United States, many in your countries and many all over the world. That's what the CIA does for a living. Okay? Please know it. It's a very unusual kind of foreign policy. Well, we're facing Munich 1938. Well, we're facing Munich 1938. Can't talk to the other side. They're evil, implacable foes. That's the only model of foreign policy we ever hear from our mass media. And the mass media repeats it entirely because it's completely suborned by the U.S. government. But in America, if you don't like the other side, you don't negotiate with them, you try to overthrow them, preferably covertly. If it doesn't work covertly, you do it overtly. You always say it's not our fault. They're the aggressor. They're the other side. They're Hitler. That comes up every 2 or 3 years. Whether it's Saddam Hussein, whether it's Assad, whether it's Putin, that's very convenient. That's the only foreign policy explanation the American people are ever given anywhere. So the war started. What was Putin's intention in the war? I can tell you what his intention was. It was to force Zelensky to negotiate neutrality. And that happened within 7 days of the start of the invasion. You should understand this, not the propaganda that's written about this. Oh, that they failed and he was going to take over Ukraine. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, understand something basic. The idea was to keep NATO, and what is NATO? It's the United States, off of Russia's border. No more, no less. I should add one very important point. Why are they so interested? First, because if China or Russia decided to have a military base on the Rio Grande or in the Canadian border, not only would the United States freak out, we'd have war within about 10 minutes, but because the United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 and ended the nuclear arms control framework by doing so. When Zelensky said in 7 days, let's negotiate, I know the details of this exquisitely because I've talked to all the parties in detail. A couple of weeks, there was a document exchanged that President Putin had approved, that Lavrov had presented, that was being managed by the Turkish mediators. I flew to Ankara to listen in detail to what the mediators were doing. Ukraine walked away unilaterally from a near agreement. Why? Because the United States told them to. Because the UK added icing to the cake by having Bojo go in early April to Ukraine and explain. And he has recently, and if your security is in the hands of Boris Johnson, God help us all. Keith Starmer turns out to be even worse. It's unimaginable, but it is true. I wouldn't change one word from what we wrote then. Nothing was wrong in that document. And since that document, since the U.S. talked the negotiators away from the table, about 1 million Ukrainians have died or been severely wounded. And the American senators, who are as nasty and cynical and corrupt as imaginable, say this is wonderful expenditure of our money because no Americans are dying. It's the pure proxy war. One of our senators nearby me says this out loud. Mitt Romney says this out loud. It's best money America can spend. No Americans are dying. It's unreal. Boris Johnson has explained, and you can look it up, on the website that what's at stake here is Western hegemony, not Ukraine, Western hegemony. Michael and I met at the Vatican with a group in the spring of 2022 where we wrote a document explaining nothing good can come out of this war for Ukraine. Negotiate now, because anything that takes time will mean massive amounts of deaths, risk of nuclear escalation, and likely loss of the war. And this is extremely important to understand. The nuclear arms control framework is based on trying to block a first strike. The ABM treaty was a critical component of that. The U.S. unilaterally walked out of the ABM treaty in 2002. It blew a Russian gasket. So everything I've been describing is in the context of the destruction of the nuclear framework as well. And starting in 2010, the U.S. put in Aegis missile systems in Poland and then in Romania. And Russia doesn't like that. And one of the issues on the table in December and January, December 2021, January 2022, was, does the United States claim the right to put missile systems in Ukraine? And Blinken told Lavrov in January 2022, the United States reserves the right to put missile systems wherever it wants. That's your putative ally. And now let's put intermediate missile systems back in Germany. The United States walked out of the INF treaty unilaterally in 2019. There is no nuclear arms framework right now. None. Now, just to bring us up to yesterday, this failed. This project failed. The idea of the project was that Russia would fold its hand. The idea all along was Russia can't resist, as Zbigniew Brzezinski explained in 1997. The Americans thought we have the upper hand. We're going to win because we're going to bluff them. They're not really going to fight. They're not really going to mobilize. The nuclear option of cutting them out of SWIFT, that's going to do them in. The economic sanctions, that's going to do them in. The HIMARS, that's going to do them in. The attempts, the F-16s. Honestly, I've listened to this for 70 years. I've listened to it as semi-understanding, I'd say, for about 56 years. They speak nonsense every day. My country, my government. This is so familiar to me, completely familiar. I begged the Ukrainians, and I had a track record with the Ukrainians. I advised the Ukrainians. I'm not anti-Ukrainian, I'm pro-Ukrainian completely. I said, save your lives, save your sovereignty, save your territory, be neutral. Don't listen to the Americans. I repeated to them the famous adage of Henry Kissinger, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. Okay, so let me repeat that for Europe. To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. So the decision was taken in 1994 to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is a project. This is not one administration or another. This is a U.S. government project that started more than 30 years ago. The idea was that there would be Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia as the Black Sea littoral that would deprive Russia of any international status by blocking the Black Sea and essentially by neutralizing Russia as more than a local power. Brzezinski's completely clear about this. And before Brzezinski, there was Mackinder, and who owns the island of the world owns the world. So this project goes back a long time. I think it goes back basically to Palmerston. So this project began, and we had a continuity of government for 30 years, until maybe yesterday, perhaps. 30 years of a project. Ukraine and Georgia were the keys to the project. Why? Because America learned everything it knows from the British. And so we are the wannabe British Empire. And what the British Empire understood in 1853, Lord Palmerston, is that you surround Russia in the Black Sea and you deny Russia access to the Eastern Mediterranean, and all you're watching is an American project to do that in the 21st century. In 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote The Grand Chessboard. That is not just musings of Mr. Brzezinski. That is the presentation of the decisions of the United States government explained to the public, which is how these books work. And the book describes the eastward enlargement of Europe and of NATO as simultaneous events. And there's a good chapter in that book that says, what will Russia do as Europe and NATO expand eastward? And I knew Zbigniew Brzezinski personally. He was very nice to me. I was advising Poland. He was a big help. He was a very nice and smart man, and he got everything wrong. So in 1997, he wrote in detail why Russia could do nothing but accede to the eastward expansion of NATO and Europe. In fact, he says the eastward expansion of Europe, and not just Europe, but NATO. This was a plan, a project. And he explains how Russia will never align with China. Unthinkable. Russia will never align with Iran. Russia has no vocation other than the European vocation. So as Europe moves east, there's nothing Russia can do about it. So says yet another American strategist. Is it any question why we're in war all the time? Because one thing about America is we always know what our counterparts are going to do, and we always get it wrong. And one reason we always get it wrong is that in game theory that the American strategists play, you don't actually talk to the other side. You just know what the other side's strategy is. It's wonderful. It saves so much time. You don't need any diplomacy. Now, when the Maidan occurred, I was called immediately. Oh, Professor Sachs, the new Ukrainian prime minister would like to see you to talk about the economic crisis, because I'm pretty good at that. And so I flew to Kiev and I was walked around the Maidan, and I was told how the U.S. paid the money for all the people around the Maidan. Spontaneous revolution of dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, please, where do all these media outlets come from? Where does all this organization come from? Where do all these buses come from? Where do all these people called in come from? Are you kidding? This is organized effort. And it's not a secret, except to citizens of Europe and the United States. Everyone else understands it quite clearly. Now, in 2014, the U.S. worked actively to overthrow Yanukovych. Everybody knows the phone call intercepted by my Columbia University colleague, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador Peter Piot. You don't get better evidence. The Russians intercepted her call and they put it on the internet. Listen to it. It's fascinating. I know all these people. By the way, by doing that, they all got promoted in the Biden administration. That's the job. Then came Minsk, and especially Minsk II, which, by the way, was modeled on South Tyrolean autonomy. And the Belgians could have related to Minsk II very well. It said there should be autonomy for the Russian-speaking regions in the east of Ukraine. It was supported unanimously by the UN Security Council. Trump won, raised the armaments. There were many thousands of deaths in the shelling by Ukraine in the Donbass. There was no Minsk II agreement. And then Biden came into office. And again, I know all these people. I used to be a member of the Democratic Party. I now am strictly sworn to be a member of no party, because both are the same anyway, and because this is, the Democrats became complete wars over time, and there was not one voice about peace, just like most of your parliamentarians, the same way. The United States and Ukraine decided it was not to be enforced. Germany and France, which were the guarantors of the Normandy process, let it go. And it was absolutely another direct American unipolar action with Europe, as usual, playing completely useless subsidiary role, even though it was a guarantor of the agreement. So at the end of 1991, Putin put on the table a last effort in two security agreement drafts, one with Europe and one with the United States. The U.S. put on the table December 15, 2021. I had an hour call with Jake Sullivan in the White House begging, Jake, avoid the war. You can avoid the war. All you have to do is say NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. And he said to me, oh, NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine. Don't worry about it. I said, Jake, say it publicly. No, we can't say it publicly. Say, Jake, you're going to have a war over something that isn't even going to happen? He said, don't worry, Jeff, there will be no war. These are not very bright people. So this is really my point. Now, I believe that Europe should become more integrated and more unified in the years ahead. I'm a strong believer in subsidiarity. So we were discussing, I don't think housing policy is really Europe's main issue. I think this can be handled at the local level or at the national level. I don't see it as a European issue, but I don't see foreign policy as being a 27 country issue. I see it being as a European issue. And I see security being at a European level. So I think things need to be readjusted, but I'd like to see more Europe for truly European issues and maybe less Europe for things that are properly subsidiary to Europe at the national and the local level. And I hope that such an evolution can take place. So no, I don't believe in the collective West. I don't believe in the global South. I don't believe in, all these geographies don't even make sense because I'm actually, I look at maps a lot and the global South is mostly in the North and the West is not even West. And so I don't even understand what this is about. I do believe that we could be in a true age of abundance if we got our heads on straight. We're in the biggest technological advance in human history. It's truly amazing what can be done right now. I marvel at the fact that somebody who knows no chemistry won the Nobel Peace Prize for chemistry because he's very good at deep neural networks, a genius, Demis Hassabis. They figured out protein folding that generations of biochemists spent their whole lives on. And now DeepMind figured out how to do it, by the thousands of proteins. We have friends that spent their entire life on one protein, brilliant friends. And now what we can do. I don't believe there is a collective West. I believe that there is a United States and Europe that are in some areas in parallel interests and in many areas not in parallel interest. I want Europe to lead sustainable development, climate transformation, global decency. I believe if the world looked more like Europe, it'd be a happier, more peaceful, safer world. And longevity and better food, by the way. But just saying, in any event, Europe has a vocation that is rather different from the American tradition and, frankly, from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, because it's been 200 years of Anglo-Saxon hegemony or aspirational hegemony. The British still believe they run the world. It's amazing what nostalgia means. They don't even stop. It's almost like a Monty Python skit, actually. But in any event, okay, I mention all of this because you need your own foreign policy. I issue a report, 2 reports each year, one, the World Happiness Report, and 18 of the top 20 countries, if I remember correctly, are European. This is the highest quality of life in the whole world. So you need your own policy to protect that quality of life. The United States ranks way down. And the other report, where's my colleague Guillaume? He's somewhere in the room. Here, there he is. Guillaume Lafortune is the lead author of our annual Sustainable Development Report. And almost all of the top 20 countries are European countries because you believe in this stuff. And that's why you're the happiest, except in geopolitics, but quality of life. So you need your own foreign policy, but you won't have it unless you have your own security. You just won't. And by the way, 27 countries cannot each have their own foreign policy. This is a problem. You need a European foreign policy and a European security structure. And by the way, although Michael assures me it's dead, I was the greatest fan of OSCE and believe that OSCE is the proper framework for European security. It could really work. And so basically, Russia is not going to invade Europe. This is the fundamental point. It may get up to the Dnieper River. It's not going to invade Europe. But there are real issues. The main issue for Russia was the United States, because Russia, as a major power and the largest nuclear power in the world, was profoundly concerned about U.S. unipolarity from the beginning. Now that this is seemingly, possibly ending, Europe has to open negotiations directly with Russia as well, because the United States will quickly lose interest, and you're going to be living with Russia for the next thousands of years. Okay? Europe needs to have a foreign policy that is a European foreign policy, and it needs to be a realist foreign policy. Realist is not hate. Realist is actually trying to understand both sides and to negotiate. There are 2 kinds of realists, defensive realists and offensive realists. My dear friend John Mearsheimer, who is the offensive realist, we're very close friends and I love him, but I believe more than he does, you talk to the other side and you find a way to make an understanding. So what do you want? You want to make sure that the Baltic states are secure. The best thing for the Baltic states is to stop their Russophobia. So basically, we need to behave like grown-ups. And when I constantly say that they're acting like children, Sonia always says to me, that's unfair to children. Because this is worse than children. We have a 6-year-old granddaughter and a 3-year-old grandson, and they actually make up with their friends. And we don't tell them, go, just ridicule them tomorrow and every day. We say, go, give them a hug and go play. And they do. This is not hard. This is the most important thing. Estonia has about 25% Russian citizens, or Russian-speaking citizens, ethnic Russians. Latvia, the same. Don't provoke the neighbor. That's all. This is not hard. It really isn't hard. And again, I want to explain my point of view. I have helped these countries, the ones I'm talking about, trying to advise. I'm not their enemy. I'm not Putin's puppet. I'm not Putin's apologist. I worked in Estonia. They gave me, I think it's the 2nd highest civilian honor that a president of Estonia can bestow on a non-national, because I designed their currency system for them in 1992. So I'm giving them advice. Do not stand there, Estonia, and say, we want to break up Russia. Are you kidding? Don't. This is not how to survive in this world. You survive with mutual respect, actually. You survive in negotiation. You survive in discussion. You don't outlaw the Russian language. Not a good idea when 25% of your population has a first language of Russian. It's not right even if there weren't a giant on the border. It wouldn't be the right thing to do. You'd have it as an official language. You'd have a language of in lower school. You wouldn't antagonize the Russian Orthodox Church. My first recommendation, with all respect to Brussels, is move the NATO headquarters somewhere else. I mean it seriously, because one of the worst parts of European policy right now is a complete confusion of Europe and NATO. These are completely different, but they became exactly the same. Europe is much better than NATO. In my opinion, NATO isn't even needed anymore. I would have ended it in 1991. But because the US viewed it as an instrument of hegemony, not as a defense against Russia, it continued afterwards. My own view, again, with all respect to Michael, we only had a brief conversation about it, is that Europe basically should have its own foreign policy and its own military security, its own strategic autonomy, so-called. And it should. I'm in favor of that. I would disband NATO, and maybe Trump is going to do it anyway. Maybe Trump's going to invade Greenland. Who knows? Then you're really going to find out what NATO means. But the confusion of NATO and Europe is deadly, because expanding Europe meant expanding NATO, period. And these should have been completely different things. So this is the first point. So I do think that Europe should invest in its security. 5% is outlandish, ridiculous, absurd, completely absurd. No one needs to spend anything like that amount. 2 to 3% of GDP, probably under the current circumstances.